Well, the day after the Mets officially move on from Luis Rojas, we will do our official Mets postmortem from the 2021 season. Keith is here. Andy's here. I guess I'm here as well. It all starts right now. All right, welcome to the Shea Anything podcast, everybody. It's Doug Williams, Andy Martino, Keith Hernandez with you for this episode. A reminder to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're listening to this podcast. We appreciate it. And Shea Anything is brought to you by Verizon. It's 5G built right for the Mets from the network more people rely on, only on Verizon. And once again, weeknights, 6 o'clock, SNY on your television, baseball night in New York. You can catch Andy on there a couple nights a week, myself as well. It's a fun show. Check us out. So yesterday, the Mets officially announced they will not be renewing the contract of Luis Rojas as their manager after 2 years, one 60-game season. And obviously 2021 being the disappointment that it was on paper, it seemed like a decision that makes sense given that the team has underperformed in those 2 seasons. But obviously there's much more nuance to all of it, and we'll get into that on this episode. Andy, I asked you at the top of Baseball Night in New York last night if this was the news you expected to be reporting on, given that, this is something I know you've been digging around for a while now that you've had about 24 hours to digest the news. What do you think it means for Rojas, and what do you think it means for the Mets?
It means that Rojas will probably go on to be successful, certainly in baseball and perhaps in a manager job in a market that isn't so cruel about every in-game move and so results-based in the sense that, look, Bob Melvin, who we're talking about as a potential Mets manager next year, has had seasons where he's won big in Oakland and seasons where he's won 68 games. And if you're the right guy with a steady hand, you're allowed to stay. But what it tells me about the Mets is that they're doing what New York teams do, which is firing a manager if the team underperforms, whether it's the manager's fault or not. Obviously, Doug, it's my opinion that this wasn't the manager's fault. I haven't had a chance to talk about this with Keith yet or hear from him other than on the broadcast. So I'm very interested to hear what a baseball person thinks as opposed to a reporter. But for me, watching the games and covering the teams, it tells me that the Mets did something that it seemed like they had to do. But if you really were to take a step back and look at it, they parted with a good baseball man, and I'm not sure that should have been necessary.
Keith, what do you think?
Well, I don't feel that it's all on Louis, and I think that managers today are trapped with people in this bureaucracy that has infiltrated the clubhouse of analytics that have such a power over lineups, over how long a pitcher pitches. I just feel that Louis is a baseball guy, and he comes from good baseball stock from his father, and I think Louis had to go along. I think every manager has to go along with what the analytics department says, and whether they like it or not. I think Dave Roberts is a classic example. You can read between the lines in some of his interviews over the years that he's managed the Dodgers, but they've won. So I think Louis is kind of like the fall guy. I suspect that they will hire a manager that will, this is my opinion, and I have nothing to back it up with, that will be more analytic bound and come on, how'd you get? And
that cat is
I know
much in love with you, Keith.
He just loves you so much. It's crazy.
He likes attention. He's not like your normal cat that like will go in a corner. You never see him for a whole day. He's
clearly
like, but anyway, I can't say it's unfair. Louis knew what he signed up for. The team underperformed. And this was a seriously disappointing season. Everybody has injuries. Other teams that found their way through their injuries. The Mets didn't. I'm just a little concerned if they want to change the culture. I think that it's a lot deeper than Luis Rojas. I think it goes a lot deeper within the organization.
I'm interested in asking you, Keith, then what you think. I know you could go on probably all day, but top line, like in terms of changing the culture, Rojas aside, what do you see that would be realistically changed culture-wise by next season?
I would like just to see, it's such a difficult topic. They were so high on the roller coaster in May when they were having the great season. And then you look and ironically, the best month they had was when everybody was hurt, and it was the bench mob. And they were the veterans. So I would like to see less emotion, less roller coaster highs and lows. So it just wears you down. You can't play 162 games like that. And I don't mean that they're going to sit there with their hands sitting on their hands. I mean, they can, the emotion of the moment's fine, but I just think they need to be more even keeled emotionally. And that may not even be the answer. I mean, you had a lot of key people that were expected to hit and did not. They had bad years. Okay. And that's all there was to it. They were terrible with men in scoring position. They were terrible with runs per game. They didn't score runs. If they had a mediocre pitching staff or an average pitching staff, they would have been 20 games under 500.
I want to go through two things that Keith and Andy have said so far. First is Keith's point that they're going to find someone more analytical. And Andy, I kind of want to, not fact check, but I'm just curious in your reporting. Was that an issue with Rojas? Is he a baseball guy to the point where he ever resisted that influence?
I think he got caught in between how much he wanted to resist. And there were some things with the coaching staff. For example, like to take you inside it a little bit, one understanding that I had was that Dave Joust, who was a friend of Rojas's father and close with his family, tended more on the, I hate the term old school. So just understanding that I'm really simplifying it when it came to in-game decisions to make the decision.
I think, by the way, that's the closest Haji's ever gotten to the screen itself. He really just made a point in the middle of Andy's point.
It may have been shut up. You don't know what you're talking about, like my daddy does, or it might have been, yes, Andy, I agree. I don't know Haji well enough to say, but whichever it was, I would say that I don't know if Haji would agree with Dave Joust's more old school form of game management, which was sometimes in Rojas's ear. And then you had these kind of newfangled hitting coaches that they brought in for Chili Davis. You had Jeremy Hefner, who's analytically educated, but a good baseball guy, just sort of like a very reasonable person who can see all sides, who I think could be kind of in the middle sometimes. And as you'll see on any team, I'm only magnifying it here because it didn't work with the Mets, but you had some disagreement over in-game moves between one school and another school within the staff. And perhaps as a leader, Louis was a really good listener and maybe not someone who was like, you know what, I'm going to hit and run here. Screw it. And maybe he got caught in between sometimes. Keith, what do you think of that analysis? You watch most of the games.
I don't think that the manager has that much leeway. If he wants to, he should be the guy in control and not listening to all the outside influences, and they're pulling and tugging one way or the other, but you're not going to survive. You better win.
This is where I actually think that from a baseball standpoint, Doug, and we've talked about this before, the Mets actually missing out on Jared Porter. It's too bad he had to have that messy personal scandal, because what Sandy Alderson was actually looking for when he got here a year ago for the second time was, I know I'm the analytics guy historically. I talked to Sandy about this. He's like, I want to make it more human. It's gone too far, and I want to bring it back a little to a middle ground. So Sandy was looking for somebody who could speak the scout language and could also read the TrackMan data. And Porter actually, by all accounts, was pretty good at that. Zach Scott was more of a analytics guy. And, then they hired the research and development people and everything. But one of the many unfortunate things for the Mets over the past season was losing that moderating voice that Jared Porter was supposed to be. And that's what Sandy wanted. And now I hear you, Keith. Now that balance is probably not there.
The other question that I wanted to ask was from Keith's first point, which was, I feel like there's a difference between firing a manager because you feel like you have to give a pound of flesh to a fan base that's disappointed and for good reason, or firing a manager because you really don't think he's the best option for the job. And so, Andy, given how frequently you report on things under the regime of Sandy Alderson and the scandals that you just mentioned with Porter and Zach Scott and everything you know about the Mets front office, do you think that Sandy is appealing to the fan base with this move and this decision? Or do you think he believes he can find a better manager than Luis Rojas and that's it?
He believes that it was time to move on from Luis Rojas. He wasn't trying to appease anybody. It's not just the results. It's the fact, sort of what I just mentioned, perhaps the forcefulness of the personality is something that Rojas could grow into a little bit. Sandy's always been a GM who gets critical of managers' moves. That's just, I mean, he and Terry Collins were going at it for, what was it, 7 years? It's kind of amazing that Terry lasted that long, actually, because Sandy's not a big manager guy. It's just the way it is. And with Rojas, I think there was just also a sense that the players had become too influential in a bad way. And some of Lindor's behaviors were allowed to go on when perhaps Lindor wasn't ready to have that kind of quote unquote leadership or freedom. And some of those things that like a leadership deficit that the current front office saw with Rojas, because they looked at some of the players doing what they were doing. I mean, there were Mets people that were embarrassed by the way that Lindor and to a certain extent Jonathan VR behaved in that Yankees game with the whistling into the dugout. And it was just like, ultimately, I think that Alderson and his people looked at Rojas and said, this wasn't your fault, but this happened on your watch.
And I think that's an important thing to dig into, because a lot of us can sit here and say, well, it's the results. The Mets had back-to-back disappointing seasons under Luis Rojas, and that, it makes sense why he's gone. Yeah, that's all true. But it sounds like at the end of the day, that's not why he wasn't renewed. The reason he was not renewed was because Sandy Alderson thinks he can find a better manager. But obviously, if they had won 100 games in both seasons, we wouldn't be talking about this. So both things can be true. Keith, to what Andy was just saying, between the rat and raccoon story, between the thumbs down thing, between the Yankees whistling story that Andy just mentioned, if you put yourself in that clubhouse, if you had a manager that you feared in a good way, but somebody who you did not want learning that you were doing anything extracurricular, anything he wouldn't approve of, would stories like that have more of a tendency to be squashed before they happened than if you have a more players friendly guy like Rojas was?
Well, I think feared is probably the wrong word. And I think, and I'm not saying that this is the case with Louis, but I think you respect your manager. He's the boss. I just think I cringed in May when they were riding high and all the antics after home runs and everybody telling me, oh, let them just have fun. And you're an old dinosaur. Well, that's part of, you behave professionally. I think there needs to be a code of conduct. And I think it needs to come from the very top. That you are wearing the orange and blue, you are representing the New York Mets, you are representing the city in the 5 boroughs of New York, in the surrounding areas, your Met fan base, and behave appropriately, professionally. The Giants came in and they behaved like professionals. They cleaned our clock and there was no jumping up and down and antics. They shook hands. They were totally into it. And I'm not saying that you have to suppress the players, but I just feel there has to be a code of conduct. And that this is how we behave on and off the field. And do so appropriately and have it enforced. That's my feeling. If you're going to want to change the culture, we've got a young group here that wants to be the leaders of this team. Well, they got to act like leaders. And that is example on the field. I know that it goes beyond playing hard and playing every day. How you conduct yourself professionally when you're in a 10 for 15 hot streak or an 0 for 15 slump. You behave professionally the same way. That's what I want to see.
Keith, let me ask you something about that. So I hope you know me well enough to know that I'm not one to sit here and say like, oh, come on, get with the times. Let the kids play. I respect you and a Terry Collins and anyone else who's been raised in the traditions of the game thinks about these things. And that's where I'm coming from. My question is, if you have players in their 20s who want to be leaders like Francisco Lindor, who are going to be more like celebratory and expressive, or Pete. Thank you. Because Pete's a big one for that kind of stuff that you're talking about. Absolutely. What's the middle ground there where they can be themselves and not suppress who you are, but also be professional in the way that you're saying? How do you recommend they strike that balance? Any thoughts about that?
Well, what you said earlier, you said that you think the analytics has gone too far and now the pendulum needs to come back. Well, I think in baseball, it got to a point, I don't know how many decades ago, maybe in the 90s, we started bantering about. The athlete in my day never said that we were entertainers. And I guess we are. We are providing entertainment, but it's not show business. And I think that pendulum, which started swaying to that, all this stuff, and it comes to mind the All-Star game when Barry Bonds got robbed of the home run, and he hugged the outfielder that robbed him in the All-Star game. That was the beginning of it when it started, and that's part of the entertainment. Everybody, oh, how great, how lovely. I think it's gone way too far now. And it needs to come back. And all the teams are doing all this and all that and all this and all that. It's, to me, you get a base hit, don't show up anybody. I mean, Stroman said it when they got on Stroman, and Stroman said, hey, look, they get a blooper to left field off of me, and they're over there doing all this. I don't care. I don't mind about that. Why should you mind me? And I agreed with Stroman on that. And I think that's gone too far. I just think it's gone too far. You never want to show up a pitcher. A pitcher never wants to show up a hitter. Okay. And it's a lot of that going on today. And it's accepted by the players. I mean, I know I am 1990, 30 years out of the game. So I'm almost 2 generations removed. I always go by decades. So I'm, fairly removed from the game, and times have changed. And the game has changed in that regard. And it's become too much show business and not enough business on the field.
What's funny is my opinion is I don't necessarily have that problem with the game. I did have that problem with the Mets. The celebrations, that kind of thing, with the younger generation, acting like entertainers doesn't bother me. And look, I'm younger than Keith, and it's kind of the baseball I've grown up watching. However, with the Mets, the phrases, the T-shirts, the fake hitting coach, it was all just a little much. And again, we just haven't seen this young group win. So it has a different tone to it than it would if they got to the NLCS last year or, what have you. It was just a little much. And Andy's talked on this podcast about the post-game interviews with, acting like they've accomplished something, just generally speaking. And I think this year, and maybe seeing a manager go that they clearly all liked from what they say publicly, will have some sort of effect. You're listening to the Shea Anything podcast. Is brought to you by Verizon. It's 5G built right for the Mets from the network more people rely on, only on Verizon. Early favorites for who the next manager might be, or is that impossible to answer, not knowing who their next president of baseball operations might be?
Yeah, that one that you just said. It's a question mark. There's some we can say that there's some concrete substance behind Bob Melvin as a name, because I know for a fact that the Mets would be interested in luring Billy Beane and Bob Melvin together. I've been told that. I don't know.
Did you like that, Keith? I was curious. You had some sort of nonverbal reaction, an expression to what Andy was just saying.
We need to get a president and we need to get a general manager real quick. Yes, there's no question about that. We can't be rudderless. We have got to get someone at the helm pronto, ASAP. Okay, Louis the first. It's got to be you got to get the heads of the organization. You got to get them in place.
I would expect them to have some clarity on whether Billy Beane's interested now soon, because Oakland's obviously out of the playoffs. That's the most likely guy, and you might be able to trade for Melvin and Beane from there. I couldn't say who the manager is going to be, because it could be, it's going to be a guy, and then he's going to want to bring in his guy. So well,
if they trade for Melvin and Beane,
then it's that. What
would
that? I mean, could you just trade like JD Davis for Bob Melvin and Billy Beane?
Sure.
What about Bruce? What about Bruce Bochy? I understand he wants to manage again. I know that Alderson probably would not hire him. I was going to
say.
Yes. Alderson fired him from San Diego.
That's right.
But Bochy I understand what I've heard whispers that Bochy wants to manage again.
Well, that's interesting. And that, obviously I understand the same history about Bochy and Alderson, but, Steve Cohen's team. Bochy has a good track record, so we'll see about that.
He's a Hall of Famer, so I don't know how many Hall of Famers Sandy Alderson has available to him, but that's one. And so what I find interesting, Andy, is Sandy Alderson has worked with Billy Beane, and in the period where he was not with the Mets before being brought back, he was an advisor to Beane or worked in that front office.
Yeah.
Do you think that he has a leg up knowing that?
Oh yeah, if he wants the job. Look, this is Steve Cohen's decision. It's overwhelmingly more than it's Sandy Alderson's decision, because Cohen's looking for someone he can have as a partner in running this team for a long time. So the front runner of this is going to be the guy who emerges, or woman, but I don't hear any women on this radar, frankly, who emerges from the conversation with Steve Cohen, with them feeling connected and excited about working together. But before any of that happens, Billy Beane's the one out of a very short list that seems the most plausible, because you don't rule out Theo Epstein, but I just hear that the mutual interest is not that strong at this point on either side. And that David Stearns, just nobody expects him to come out to be available out of Milwaukee yet. And by the way, this is a young guy who succeeded in Milwaukee. There's no guarantee that, I understand he was a Mets intern, but there's no guarantee that this is going to work in New York just because it works somewhere else and he's smart. So short list, and Beane's the one that there's at least some early heat around, but we'll see. That could be a no tomorrow, and then they have to move on. We'll see how it goes.
So we'll see if Billy wants to leave Northern California.
Exactly.
Beautiful Northern California, which I'm sure you can afford to live and pay the taxes there, and come back to New York. An entirely different environment, and an entirely more competitive environment. It's more razor's edge here, where Oakland, it's amazing what he's done there with what he's had to work with. He's got a winning formula, but there's not the pressure. It's Oakland is just like, oh gosh, here they are again. How do they do it?
Yeah.
In New York, it is, you better do it.
Yeah. It's fascinating to think about Billy Beane with Steve Cohen's money. I keep putting it that way because he just hasn't had anything close to that. And to Keith's point, we always give the A's credit for doing what they do with what they have.
Mm-hmm.
and the expectations will be totally different. And Keith, I want to get your take on one of the first things that Andy mentioned on the podcast, and this is a point that he's made a couple of times, is that we do this thing in New York now. I say now, but we've done it for a long time, where we don't let a good manager, by all accounts, continue to manage if the team has a bad season, even though we are aware of how little the manager is able to do in the current climate. So do you think that if the Mets hire their next manager and he's just a good manager with a good reputation, is liked by the players, is good with the media, and makes more good decisions than bad, will we let that person survive some bad seasons, or are we always just going to recycle new ones after new ones after new ones until the Mets somehow win a World Series?
Well, you can't let the mob run the office. Okay, so all the social media and Met fans that, the sky's falling, and, the Mets will have a bad 2 weeks and this guy's got to go and this guy stinks and, blah, 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 blah. You can't be stampeded. So you have to have a strong individual that can withstand all the outside pressures that come with running the ball club here, particularly the Mets. And you saw it with the Yankees. I got Yankee fan friends that were ready to quit on the team when they were struggling. They were ready to, they stink, and I'm going, it's a long season. You never know. And where are the Yankees now? They're back in postseason and they're all up and jumping around. So that has to be, you have to have someone that's going to be strong, have good character, and believes in what he believes and stands by it and sink or swim with it. Either you do it or you don't. It's going to take a strong individual. And that's pretty much in every organization. Anybody that's in control of anything has to be a strong personality and believes in himself, self-confident. I have no idea what they're going to do. Okay. I'm very curious about Bruce Bochy. If you're looking for a manager that would come in and have command respect, I think he would.
So when Keith says, Andy, that, somebody strong who doesn't bend to the pressure, et cetera, yes, that's important for a manager, but it's important for Steve Cohen more than anybody, isn't it? Because if the way I asked that question, if we're not going to have a new manager every 2 years, it's going to need to be Steve Cohen, who's not swayed by public pressure.
Yes. Agree.
I mean, all right. So let's do a 3-batter rule before we go. Questions for October. Andy, can you give us an estimated timeline for how the next few weeks will go for the Mets?
I think we'll start to hear about interviews anytime. I'd be surprised if by next week we weren't hearing leaks about that from myself or some other reporter or whoever finds out about, they're talking to this guy, they're not talking to this guy. Interviews proceed for a week or two after that. It's a pretty small pool of candidates. So unless they run into this thing again where no one wants to work there. And by the way, I say that a little facetiously, but they could have trouble. It's a small list and not everyone wants to come work in the environment that we've been discussing. So there's that. But if they can convince one of these guys to come, and like Keith said, it better be quick because the GM meetings are November 7th. And the offseason begins. By then, they like to have a GM or, a president and hopefully a manager or close to a manager. You can probably get to the winter meetings without a manager. And then the Mets just have to hope that there's a long work stoppage at the conclusion of the CBA so they can get their act together while everyone else is locked out, which could happen, by the way.
So we have that to look forward to.
December 1st, baseball could stop for a while. Keep that in mind.
Yeah, it's true. But still, you can't assume that you have to go.
No,
they have to get their act together. They have to get people in position to make decisions going forward quickly for next season.
Keith, second of the 3-batter rule. Can you give us an estimated timeline? Speaking of estimated timelines of how the next few weeks will go for you and Haji in Florida. Does Haji dress up for Halloween?
Haji does not dress up for Halloween. This is his costume right here. There he is.
His little face for
and Haji will be happy because it's warm. He's 18 and October 5th.
Wow.
He's an adult.
Is today the 4th or 5th?
Today's the 5th.
Today's the 5th.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Haji.
Happy birthday.
Bury the lead, Keith.
He is 18 today.
That's why he's been so needy. He's like, Dad, give me some attention. It's
He
my
wants to
birthday.
go out. He wants to go outside and I got a big cage for him. He wants to go out and get some air.
Haji, go buy a
happy
pack of
birthday.
cigarettes because you can. Happy 18th.
Yeah, happy 18th, Haji.
So happy 18th. He likes the warm weather, and my balcony. I have a nice round couch out there on the balcony, and I have western exposure, so he gets the afternoon sun, and he just lays out. He can go in and out whenever he wants. So here I have to let him out. But he's his own man. He can stay in or go out whenever he wants, and he loves it down there. I will be starting when I get down there, getting myself back in shape, and I'm getting X-rays tomorrow on my hips to see if I need starting the process of see if I need double hip replacement. My hips have been really bothering me, so I'm going to find that out right away. So that's the first order of business for me in the off season.
Is that baseball related from way back?
Yeah.
Kind of deterioration?
Yeah, I had an old injury. Ironically, when I was young at Shea Stadium, there was a rain delay, long rain delay. We picked up the game, and I was at first base, and ground ball double play, and I went and slid in to break up the double play. And I always used to put my right foot forward, and I bent my left, and I went up in the air, and I had my right foot bent and my left foot forward. And I got in midair, and I went, "Oh, what did I just do?" And I totally screwed up my slide. I came in at an angle with my bent leg, which is my right, and it went into the field was wet and muddy, and it just drove my femur right up into my hip socket.
Ow.
And I was 23, 24, and I heard it crunch, and I said, "Uh-oh." So I made a move to get up, and I'm very carefully, and it was fine. And I trotted off the field. And I said, that's going to come back and haunt me later in my life.
And here we are.
And here we are.
It's not fair.
An 18-year-old cat, and you're just hoping that your insurance covers a couple hip replacements. And
yes.
Okay, so both of you, for the last one, who's going to win the World Series?
Whew.
That's a tough one. It's hard to. I'm pulling. Excuse me, for Houston and Dusty Baker.
I was kind of going to say Houston. They just had this thing. I know they don't have Springer anymore, and he was one of their big clutch guys, but they've got this us against the world thing that we saw last year when they didn't have a great team and they almost ran the table. When they get hot, they're just unstoppable in October. And I just saw Tampa over the weekend with the Yankees, obviously, and they're so good. It's hard to see them losing in the American League. So I think it's going to be one of those two teams coming out of the AL.
I think the Dodgers are going to win again. I just think they have the best roster. They'll get Max Muncy back at some point. They'll finally put it together after kind of a messy season where they won over 100 games because they're so talented that they can do it.
Well, everybody thought that they were going to overtake the Giants, and they got to give the Giants credit. They did not fold because the Dodgers didn't lose, and they had a 2-game lead for the whole last 2 weeks of the season, 2.5 weeks, and the Giants never lost. They did not fold, and that showed me something big time. I was ready for them to kind of maybe, when you're in the lead, it's a little different than when you're chasing, and they hung in there. So don't sell the Giants short. On paper, the Dodgers certainly look a lot better, but the Giants find a way to win.
I am not trying to sell the Giants short. Having said that, if the Dodgers win the wild card game, they'll beat the Giants. That's my prediction.
And then we'll see what happens with the Cardinals.
Yeah, I know. Cardinals are good.
True.
Oh my God. That's
a
a good one.
It is.
Isn't it crazy? It's 2021, and this postseason may end up being defined by Buster Posey and Adam Wainwright in the National League.
Dusty Baker and Tony La Russa
in the American League. Yeah.
Good point. Good point.
Reminder to subscribe to the Shea Anything podcast, Apple, Spotify, wherever you're listening. We appreciate it. Another reminder, the Shea Anything is brought to you by Verizon. It's 5G built right for the Mets from the network. More people rely on, only on Verizon. Andy, Keith, good stuff today. We appreciate it. We'll be back with you guys listening later this week with Jerry Blevins. Thanks as always for listening. We'll talk to you then.